You knew not to track mud past the threshold. She'd have the broom behind you before your second foot hit the floor. Every surface had a day, every child had a task, and lye soap before breakfast meant the week was starting right. Here are 30 old hillbilly habits for a perfectly clean house. Monday was not just a day of the week in a hillbilly household. It was a law. Wash day fell on Monday because it always had, because your grandmother's grandmother had started the fire before sunup on a Monday, and nothing short of a funeral moved it to Tuesday. The night before, every piece of clothing was sorted into piles, whites, coloreds, and work breeches thick with field dirt. By dawn, the iron pot in the backyard already sat over a fire. Women in the Appalachian Mountains organized their entire week around that single day: Monday washing, Tuesday ironing, Wednesday mending, Friday baking, Saturday the house scrub. Girls learned the sequence before they could read, absorbing it by watching and doing and never being told twice. You knew which pile your school dress went in. If you had to ask, you were already behind. The women who held those schedules together are mostly gone, and with them went the unshakable certainty that Monday began with fire and water and the will to make everything clean. The outdoor wash pot was not a gentle thing. It was a cast iron cauldron set over an open wood fire, and when the water came to a rolling boil, the clothes went in whole. Overalls stiff with tobacco sap, shirts gray with a week of field sweat. All of it went into that boiling water with shaved lye soap, worked with a wooden paddle kept for nothing else. The boiling opened the weave, drove the soap into the fiber, and killed whatever was living in the cloth. By the time the clothes came out on that paddle, lifted dripping into the rinse tubs, they had been changed by heat into something clean, the way iron becomes something else in a forge. Boiling laundry remained common in Appalachian households through the 1940s and into the 50s, long after flatland women had moved to wringer washers. Up in the hollows, the cast iron pot held its ground. The women who stood over those fires in all weather never described the work as remarkable. It was just how clothes got clean. Before the clothes ever reached the boiling pot, the worst stains had to be worked by hand. Knuckle to board, full body weight, no mercy. The scrub board was a ribbed zinc or glass washboard set in the wash tub, and working a collar on one left your forearm sore by noon. She would wet the garment, rub it against the lye soap bar, then drive the soiled spot against those ribs in a hard downward stroke until the water running off ran clear. Ring around the collar on a Sunday shirt, tobacco stain on a work jacket, clay mud packed into cotton seams. All of it met the board before it met the pot. The Columbus Washboard Company in Logan, Ohio, was producing zinc scrub boards as early as the 1920s and remained the last American washboard manufacturer into the 21st century. She worked the board without complaint, water browning around her wrists. Nobody does that work now. Nobody has to. But the shirts also never came out quite so clean. Once the clothes had been wrung by hand, twisted tight between both fists until nothing more would give, they went up on the line, and the sun finished what the soap started. Sunlight does something to cotton that no dryer has ever replicated. It bleaches. The ultraviolet light that breaks down surface stains in white linens also kills the bacteria the soap left behind, and a sheet boiled, rinsed, and hung in full July sun for 4 hours came off the line smelling like nothing at all, just clean, the way air smells clean after a hard storm. Mountain women ran clotheslines between fence posts, tree branches, wire strung between 2 nails on the barn. On good drying days, the whole yard became laundry. Shirts on the lower wire, skirts on the upper, pillowcases spread flat on the grass to bleach all the way through. Children learned to read the sky before breakfast because a cloud rolling in from the west meant every hand needed to move. The sun-dried sheet folded off the line was stiff and cool and faintly bright in a way you could feel before you ever laid your face against it at night. But before any of that washing began, every child already knew their part. In a hillbilly household, the naming of a task was the whole discipline. Before 8, you were on sweeping and slop emptying. By 10, water hauling and dish drying. 12 meant you could be trusted with ironing the flat pieces, pillowcases, flour sack towels, aprons. By 14, a girl was expected to manage a full wash day without being watched. There was no chart on the wall, no reward for completion. The task was yours because the house required it. Mothers assigned chores the way they assigned names, permanently as a fact of the household. Boys took wood splitting, ash carrying, and the animals before school. Girls took the indoor work. Nobody argued the division. It was the air they breathed. The children who grew up inside that system carry something most of us never got: a bone-deep understanding that a clean house is not a weekend project but a daily practice, handled by whoever is old enough to hold the broom. Most of those children are old women now, or gone. The swept yard was one of the most recognizable marks of a well-kept Appalachian home. Not a lawn, not a garden, but a smooth, bare earth clearing that a woman tended with a corn husk broom the way a floor is tended inside. Early every morning, she worked it in long strokes, clearing leaves, chicken scratchings, any trace of what the night had left. Cherokee women of western North Carolina were documented by 19th century observers as keeping exceptionally swept yards, a practice tied to both hygiene and spiritual cleanliness that predated European settlement. In mountain communities, the swept yard also served a plain purpose. A smooth, bare surface made it easy to spot snakes near the house. Nothing could hide on a swept yard. The women who kept them knew every inch of their ground, what belonged there, what had moved overnight. They swept because their mothers had swept, and because a woman's yard said something about her that could be read from the road before you ever knocked on her door. Before the flat commercial broom became standard in the 1920s, mountain women made their own, and the corn husk broom they made was not delicate. Dried husks from the season's corn harvest were soaked until pliable, layered thick around a straight hickory handle, and bound tight with cord or stripped bark. A woman who knew what she was doing could make a broom that lasted 3 to 4 years of daily sweeping before it needed rebuilding. Shaker communities had been producing flat broom corn brooms since the early 1800s, and commercial versions had largely replaced homemade ones by mid-century. But in the isolated hollows of eastern Kentucky and western North Carolina, corn husk brooms were still being made and used into the 1950s. You maintained it the way you maintained anything useful, catching the signs of wear before the thing quit on you. The women who could make a broom from nothing are almost entirely gone now. Every spring before the hot weather settled in, the porch got whitewashed, and so did the tree trunks along the fence line, the rock foundation of the well, sometimes the outhouse. The mixture was simple: powdered limestone quicklime dissolved in water to the consistency of thin paint, then brushed onto wood or stone with a rough rag. Traditional whitewash had been used since the colonial period for its antibacterial properties. Lime's alkalinity kills surface mold and discourages insects from nesting in wood crevices. A whitewashed porch floor showed every trace of dirt in sharp relief, which meant nothing stayed on it long. USDA extension bulletins as early as the 1910s documented whitewashing tree trunks to discourage bark borers. On the mountain, the reason given was simpler. It looked clean and cared for, and a house that looked cared for said its people were not defeated. The whitewash faded by June and needed doing again the following April. No one called that a burden. It was just what came around, the same as planting and frost. Hog killing day in late November was many things: cold work, the hard business of provisioning a family for winter. But it was also soap day, because the fat nobody wanted to eat became the fat that cleaned everything. The scraps of lard trimmed from around the organs, the leaf fat from the kidneys, all of it went into the soap pot along with the lye water leaching through hardwood ash for weeks. The lye was tested the old way: drop a raw egg into the hopper drip, and if it floated with a quarter-sized spot above the surface, the lye was strong enough. Too weak, and the soap stayed soft and useless. The resulting bar, yellowish, hard once cured, carrying a slightly sour smell, served as laundry soap, dish soap, floor soap, and skin soap all at once. Linda Stewart of the Great Smoky Mountains, who has made soap by the traditional Cades Cove settlers' method for more than 15 years, describes it as effective on eczema, poison ivy, insect bites, and dirty laundry alike. Nothing in those mountains was wasted. The hog fed the family, and the fat of the hog cleaned the house. There was always a jug of vinegar under the kitchen shelf. Not store vinegar in most households, but rough apple cider vinegar made from fall windfalls and stored through winter. It went into everything: the final laundry rinse, which it softened and deodorized; the window washing bucket, where it cut the smoke film that coated glass near a wood stove; the floor mop water, where its acidity lifted grease in a way plain water never could. You rubbed it on the table after cutting meat. You soaked a cloth in it and pressed it to a child's fever. You poured it into the outhouse rinse bucket. Acetic acid, even in homemade low-concentration cider vinegar, breaks down grease, neutralizes odors, and kills surface bacteria. Mountain women didn't know the chemistry. They knew the results, and they knew their mother had done it the same way, and her mother before that. The jug ran empty and got refilled. It was never not there. If there was one trick that marked the women who had been taught from those who had to figure it out alone, it was this one. You didn't reach for a rag to wash the windows. You crumpled yesterday's newspaper, the Knoxville Sentinel, the Asheville Citizen-Times, whatever was there, into a tight ball, dipped it in the vinegar water bucket, and wiped the glass in long strokes from the top down. No lint, no streaks. The compressed newsprint fibers, fine and dense, polished the glass as they dried it. The newspaper window washing method appears in farmhouse guides and extension service pamphlets going back to the 1920s, and the science holds. Paper fibers are more uniform than cotton rag weave, which is what creates the streak-free finish. Knowing the science wasn't the point. Knowing the trick was. A woman who knew it could wash every window in a 5-room house with 2 pages and a cup of vinegar water. The women who didn't know reached for rags and wondered why the glass always looked smeared. The cedar chest sat at the foot of the bed, heavy and dark, smelling of the forest the tree had come from, and nothing went into it carelessly. The good wool blankets, the hand-sewn quilts that had taken months. The winter coat, everything folded tight, cedar chips packed between the layers, the chest sealed when not in use. The eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana, common in fence rows throughout Appalachia, produces a natural oil in its heartwood that interferes with the feeding of clothes' moth larvae, specifically Tiniola bacilliella, the common webbing moth. Mountain families did not know the Latin. They knew the smell kept the moths out and had known it for generations. A cedar chest was not a luxury. It was protective equipment, as practical as a smokehouse. A daughter expected to receive one at marriage the way she expected a quilt, and the chest itself might outlast 3 or 4 women who owned it. The smell of cedar from an open chest is one of those memories people carry their whole lives without knowing where it comes from, until they do, and the person they would ask is gone. Coarse salt was the kitchen scrubber that cost almost nothing and worked on almost everything. And the women who knew how to use it never bothered with anything else. The cutting board after raw chicken got a handful of coarse salt, rubbed in hard with the heel of the hand in circles, then scraped and wiped down. Cast iron that had caught something stuck got the same treatment. Salt in the pan, a folded rag, worked in circles until the surface came clean without stripping the seasoning that decades of use had built into the iron. Wooden surfaces, breadboards, rolling pins, the kitchen table, were scrubbed with salt and a spent lemon half, the acid and the abrasive together lifting stains that soap would have left behind. Salt as a household cleaner appears in Lydia Maria Child's The American Frugal Housewife, first published in 1829, which recommended it for everything from wine stains to iron pots. The women who used it daily didn't need a book to tell them. They just knew what worked. The smell of beeswax warming in an old tin on the back of the stove is one of those kitchen smells people never forget. Sweet and faintly smoky and nothing like a factory product. The wax came from the family's own hives or a neighbor's, rendered into a soft paste by mixing it with a little lard or pure turpentine, then rubbed into the bare plank floors while the wood was still warm from the morning fire. The rubbing was done on hands and knees with a cloth, working the wax into the grain, going with the plank and not against it. then a second cloth for buffing until the boards came up with a deep matte glow that no varnish ever quite matched. Beeswax and turpentine was the standard floor treatment in Federal period American homes before commercial waxes arrived in the early 20th century, and it appears in housekeeping guides as far back as the mid-1800s. The floors she kept that way were still good 80 years later. The woman who got down on her knees every spring to do it is not. What looked like a perfectly white pillowcase off the line was actually a very faint shade of yellow, and the women who knew how to fix it kept a small bottle of bluing on the shelf next to the vinegar. Laundry bluing had been sold in American households since the mid-1800s, under names like Mrs. Stewart's Bluing, which had been in continuous production since 1883 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. A drop or two went into the final rinse water, no more, or the whites would come out with a bluish cast. The pigment was indigo-based and worked by simple optics. The blue tint counteracted the yellow that cotton develops naturally over time, making the fabric read as pure white to the eye. You added it to the water first, swirled it through, then put the linens in. If you had to be told how much was enough, you'd already used too much. The pillowcases that came out of that rinse water were brighter than anything a modern bleach bottle produces today. The Sunday collar did not stand up on its own. It was made to stand. Homemade starch began with a tablespoon of plain flour or cornstarch dissolved in cold water until smooth, then stirred into boiling water until it thickened to very thin gravy. Collars, apron fronts, shirt fronts, the cuffs of a good dress, dipped while the starch was warm, worked through the fabric with the fingers, hung stiff to dry, then pressed. The iron had to be hot enough to set the starch without scorching, and you tested it on a scrap or an inside seam first. Commercial laundry starch had been sold in powdered form since the late 1800s under names like Argo cornstarch, and by the 1920s, most households kept both the powder and the habit of making their own from whatever was on hand. The collars that came off that iron stood sharp and said something about the person wearing them and the person who pressed them. That knowledge of how to do it right has nearly vanished. Saturday night meant the tin tub came in from the back porch, dragged to the spot nearest the wood stove, close enough for warmth, far enough not to catch a spark, and every kettle and pot that would hold water went on the fire, because filling a tub meant hauling and heating every drop by hand. The water was shared, oldest to youngest, because that was how it had always been done. The water that had washed your father washed you next. By the time the youngest child went in, the water was gray and barely warm. The practice of shared bath water in household order of seniority is documented in oral histories collected by the Federal Writers Project during the 1930s and 40s from Appalachian coalfield and cotton belt families alike. The youngest child learned where they stood in the order of things not from words, but from the temperature of the water. She heated every pot without being asked. She carried every bucket. That was her Saturday, and she did it without complaint. And the word for that kind of labor doesn't exist anymore in any language anyone is still speaking. She kept a mason jar with a few holes punched in the lid beside the ironing board. That was the sprinkler, and she used it with a practiced wrist flick that sent a fine mist across the fabric without soaking it through. Clothes dry off the line had to be dampened before the iron would set a proper crease. Without moisture in the fiber, a hot iron just scorched the surface. The clothes were sprinkled, rolled into a tight cylinder to hold the dampness evenly, and set aside for 20 minutes before ironing began. On cool days, they were wrapped in a flour sack towel to keep them from drying out while she worked through the pile. There was a rhythm to it: sprinkle, roll, set aside, iron the last batch while the next dampened. That she had down so smoothly it looked effortless. It looked like nothing because she had done it 1,000 times. You never saw the 1,000 times. You only saw the finished shirt hanging crisp on the chair back. Certain mountain houses had a smell that wasn't quite smoke and wasn't quite kitchen. It was something older than both. A dry herbal sweetness from bundles of sage, rosemary, pennyroyal, and mountain mint hung over the doorframes or burned slow in the fireplace when the air inside had gone flat and close. Burning dried herbs to freshen air and drive out insects is documented across Cherokee, Appalachian European descended, and African American mountain communities with pennyroyal, Mentha pelagium, specifically noted in southern Appalachian herbalism for its effectiveness against fleas and gnats. The women who burned it knew what each herb did. Sage for the smell and the bacteria, pennyroyal for the fleas, rosemary for the sick room, mountain mint for a long ironing day. They gathered it themselves in late summer, dried it in bunches from the porch rafters, and had enough to last through winter. The smell of sage smoke in a closed room reaches back past conscious thought. People who grew up in those houses recognize it immediately, even decades later, even when they can't say why. The work that showed most to the road was the porch, and it got the hardest treatment of any surface in the house. Once a week, usually after the laundry was hung and the boil water was cooling, she got down on her hands and knees with a stiff bristle brush, a bucket of well water, and a bar of lye soap worked directly into a lather on the wood. She scrubbed in sections from the wall outward, pushing the dirty water ahead of her as she went. The porch boards of an Appalachian farmhouse were typically white oak or American chestnut, dense, tight-grained hardwoods that responded well to hard scrubbing and, when kept clean and dry, lasted for generations without rotting. A clean porch meant a cared-for house. A cared-for house meant a woman who had not been defeated by the work of living in it. You could tell everything about a household from the porch before you ever knocked. Those boards are still out there, in houses all through the hollows. The women who scrubbed them on their knees are not. Twice a year, once in May when the last cold had passed and once in September before the heavy quilts went back on, the feather tick came off the bed. It was a large linen casing stuffed with goose or duck down, sometimes chicken feathers, and it served as both mattress and insulation in a bedroom that could drop below freezing on a January night. Getting it outside was a two-person job. It was heavy, and it wanted to fold in the middle. Laid flat across a fence rail in direct sun, it was beaten with a flat paddle, hard enough to knock the dust out of the fill and force air through the casing, not hard enough to split the seams. The beating drove out the accumulated oils and dead skin, and the UV from a full day's sun killed the dust mites that caused the coughing and sneezing that mountain people treated with every remedy but the cause. She knew the tick needed doing when the sleepers started waking up, stopped up. No other signal was required. The tick went out on a clear morning and came in before the dew, smelling like a field in sunlight. Nothing left a hillbilly household as fabric. Not the shirts too thin to patch one more time. Not the flannel nightgowns worn soft as skin. Not the wool socks with the heels blown out. Everything that could no longer serve as clothing was cut into strips, sorted by weight, and braided or hooked into floor rugs that outlasted the garments they came from. The braided rug was made in long three-strand coils, thick strips of wool or flannel braided tight, then coiled flat and sewn together with a heavy needle and linen thread, building from the center outward until large enough to fill a doorway or anchor a bedroom floor. The hooked rug used a burlap feed sack backing and a hook to pull loops of fabric strip up through the mesh row by row. Hooked rugs made from recycled feed sacks and worn clothing are documented in WPA craft surveys of southern Appalachia from the 1930s and 40s as a primary floor covering tradition, with some examples detailed enough to qualify as folk art. The rug underfoot had been your grandfather's work jacket. The one by the kitchen door had been your mother's winter coat. Nothing left. Spring cleaning was not a weekend. It was a week, and it began the day the weather held 2 warm days in a row after the last frost. The curtains came down first, pulled from every rod, hauled outside, soaked in cold water, wrung and pinned on the line while the rods themselves got a vinegar wipe. Walls were wiped from ceiling to baseboard, a damp cloth working in sections to lift the soot and grease that had settled since the previous fall. Every bed was stripped, the wool blankets beaten outside and aired on the fence line for a day. The sequence, curtains first, walls, floors, bedding, furnishings, appears in WPA Oral Histories of Southern Housewives from the 1930s and 40s as the standard order, passed from mother to daughter without ever being written anywhere. By the end of the week, the house smelled of vinegar and clean air and the cold that still came in at night. She stood in the middle of it, and it was enough. And if the annual scrub was the week everything got done right, the coffee grounds on the floor was the trick that kept it manageable the other 51 weeks. Before sweeping a dirt floor or a plank floor that shed a lot of dust, you scattered used coffee grounds across the surface, still damp from the morning pot, let them sit for a few minutes, then swept as normal. The damp grounds weighed down the fine dust that would otherwise rise in a cloud and resettle before you finished, meaning you actually moved the dirt out of the house instead of relocating it into the air. It also left the floor smelling like the kitchen did on a good morning. Coffee grounds as a sweeping compound appear in 19th century and early 20th century American household guides as a substitute for the commercial sweeping compounds sold in hardware stores. Sand and sawdust mixtures used in barbershops and general stores for the same dust control purpose. On the mountain, nobody bought sweeping compound. They had grounds from breakfast and a broom. That was enough to get the floor clean without raising a cloud, and that was enough. Past the big events and the weekly rituals, there were the daily habits that held the house together without ever being named. And borax was one of them. A half cup of 20 Mule Team Borax in the wash water alongside the lye soap boosted the cleaning power of the whole wash without costing much. Borax softens hard water, raises the pH so grease releases more easily from fabric, and leaves linens whiter than soap alone ever managed. 20 Mule Team Borax had been sold continuously since 1891, named for the 20 mule wagon teams that hauled it out of the California desert borax mines in Death Valley. Mountain women didn't know the Death Valley story. They knew the box with the mule team on it. They knew what it did to a load of wash, and they kept it on the shelf the same way they kept vinegar and salt. Not as a specialty product, but as a basic supply, as ordinary as the soap itself. The women who knew to add it are mostly gone now. The box is still on shelves in hardware stores, waiting. The fine pale ash that sifted down to the bottom of the firebox overnight was not waste. It was the next morning's scouring powder, and a woman who kept a clean kitchen never let it go cold without saving the best of it. The softest ash from hardwoods burned slow and hot, oak, hickory, locust, was scooped into a tin kept beside the stove, and when the cast iron skillet had something burned to it, a pinch of ash on a damp rag worked it clean without scratching the iron or stripping the cure. Wood ash contains potassium carbonate, potash, which is mildly alkaline and abrasive at the fine ash particle size, making it chemically similar to commercial baking soda cleaners but free, abundant, and produced by the fire that had been burning anyway. The same ash, dissolved in hot water and left to settle, produced the lye liquor used in soap making. Nothing from that fire left the house without doing something useful first. The ash cleaned the cookware. The cookware fed the family. That was the whole economy of it, running in a closed circle that wasted nothing at all. Certain things lived under the bed in a hillbilly household that had nothing to do with dust and everything to do with what was living in the cracks of the floor. Dried pennyroyal, bay leaves, and black walnut hulls were tucked into bed frame corners, along the baseboards, inside straw tick seams, and under the rag rug. Not for scent, but for function, because the oils in those plants are genuinely toxic to fleas and irritating to the mites that nested in warm bedding. Pennyroyal contains pelargone, an organic compound documented as an effective flea repellent at natural concentrations. Black walnut hulls contain juglone, which disrupts the life cycles of common household insects. Mountain women didn't use those names. They used what their grandmothers had used, replacing the bundles when the smell faded, knowing by the absence of bites whether the herbs were still working. Nobody wrote it down. You kept it in your hands and your nose, not on paper, and when the hands that knew it were still, the knowledge went with them. Once a week, sometimes twice in heavy-use months, the iron stove got blackened, and it was not a quick job. The stove had to be cool, and every surface was brushed clean of ash with a dry brush before the blacking went on. Stove Black was a graphite-based paste sold in small tins under names like Stove Bright and Satin Glow. Applied with a stiff cloth, worked into every surface and seam, then buffed with a dry cloth until the iron held a deep, low gleam. The graphite sealed surface pores in the cast iron against moisture, slowing the rust that would eventually eat through an untended stove, and the weekly ritual was also the weekly inspection, running your hands over every joint and firebox door seam, catching the small things before they became large ones. She did it the way she did every other thing in that kitchen, steadily, without ceremony, as though it were simply what a person did when they cared about the thing they were tending. When she was gone, the stove went cold. Not everything in the house got washed the same way, and not everything got washed at all, not if it could help it. The christening dress lived in its own piece of muslin, folded flat and wrapped without starch, because starch weakens linen over decades, and the women who kept these things knew that. It went into the cedar chest with dried lavender, not cedar chips, because the oil in cedar chips is strong enough to yellow fine cotton over long storage. When a child was born, the dress came out, aired for a day away from direct sun, then went back the same afternoon, washed only in cold water, never boiled, never wrung. It had been worn by this woman's mother and her mother's mother, and the care it required was not an inconvenience but a form of honor. It wasn't just a garment. It was a record of every child who had passed through, which meant it carried the weight of everyone already gone. Some of those dresses are still folded in back bedrooms, still wrapped in their muslin, still waiting. When someone died in a hillbilly household, the washing began before the body was cold. The women of the community came, neighbors, aunts, the older women who knew what to do, and the house was cleaned from ceiling to floor with a thoroughness that exceeded any regular Saturday. Every surface the deceased had touched was washed. The bedding was stripped and taken outside. The floor where the sickbed had stood was scrubbed on hands and knees. The windows were opened regardless of weather, and sage or cedar smoke was let in to sweeten the rooms. This practice, the ritual washing of a house after a death, is documented across Appalachian, African American Southern, and several indigenous American communities as a tradition combining the practical need to sanitize a sick room with the cultural need to prepare a space for grief. The women who came did not ask if they were needed. They came, they worked without speaking more than necessary, and they left the house clean. That was what they gave. Hominy is corn soaked in an alkaline solution, wood ash, lye, or slaked lime, until the outer hull loosens and the kernel becomes something entirely different, a process called nixtamalization that the Cherokee and other Native American nations had practiced for centuries before European settlers arrived in the Appalachian Mountains and learned it from them. The alkaline treatment unlocked niacin that dried corn could not release on its own, and the settlers who adopted it kept their families healthier without knowing exactly why. By the 1950s, most Appalachian families got their hominy from a can. Van Camp's was the brand most kitchens stocked, warming it in a skillet with butter and cracked black pepper. Old-timers remembered when it was supper itself, heaped into a bowl, eaten hot enough to steam. The flavor was different from grits, blunter and chewier, and anyone who grew up eating it never confused the two. It was its own thing, and the people who understood that distinction are mostly gone.
Fried corn was summer captured in a skillet made from fresh ears cut straight off the cob when gardens overflowed. Black housewives sliced the kernels off, then scraped the cob to release the milky starch that made the dish creamy. The corn went into a hot skillet with bacon grease, sizzling while being stirred constantly. Salt, pepper, and sometimes sugar balanced the flavors, while natural starch thickened everything into a custard-like consistency. Served as a side, it often became the main event because nothing else could compete. Families gathered around bowls of fried corn, eating it with cornbread alongside fried chicken. The dish required no measurements because every cook knew by sight and smell when it was done. Fried corn connected families to their gardens and the satisfaction of eating what they grew.
A single pot of pinto beans could feed a family for 3 days if the woman cooking knew what she was doing, and she always did. Day one was the beans themselves, slow cooked with a ham hock, an onion, and enough water to cover, served over cornbread with raw onion on the side. Day two, She added water and a handful of elbow macaroni, turning leftover beans into a thicker soup that tasted different enough to feel new. Day 3, in went a can of tomatoes and a few drop dumplings made from flour, lard, and a splash of milk. 3 nights, 3 textures, 3 flavors, all from one pot of dried beans that cost pennies. The trick was never letting it boil dry and knowing when to add the water. Too early and it thinned out. Too late and the bottom scorched, which meant losing the fond that gave Day 3 its depth. You learned it by standing at the stove beside her, watching the bubble rate. Chocolate gravy is exactly the kind of dish that makes people from outside Appalachia raise an eyebrow until they taste it. In Kentucky and Tennessee mountain kitchens, it was made with cocoa powder, flour, sugar, and water. No milk, no butter, cooked until thick and glossy, then spooned hot over biscuits as a supper that was both meal and dessert, and neither one exactly. The recipe spread through families in the Cumberland Plateau, from women who knew that sugar and starch could fill a stomach as surely as any meat, and that children who refused beans for the 3rd night running would eat without complaint if something sweet came with it. The wider food world discovered chocolate gravy in the early 2000s and called it Southern, but it was Appalachian first, specific to these mountains. Every family made it slightly differently, some using milk, some adding butter at the end, some keeping no written recipe at all. When your grandmother stopped making it, the version she made stopped existing, and the distance between her version and every other version closed to nothing.
Crackling bread transformed the crispy bits left from rendering lard into something special. Black housewives folded cracklings, the golden pieces of fried pork skin and fat, directly into cornbread batter before baking. The cracklings added bursts of salty, smoky richness throughout, creating pockets of flavor that made each bite different. Baked in cast iron skillets, the bread developed a crunchy crust on the bottom while staying tender inside. It was served alongside greens, beans, or eaten warm with butter. Making crackling bread meant nothing from the hog went to waste, stretching resources as far as possible. Children loved finding cracklings hidden within each slice. The recipe varied from household to household. Crackling bread was a lesson in resourcefulness, proving scraps could become centerpieces.
The women who cooked on wood stoves understood heat the way a pianist understands keys. Every inch of that iron surface ran at a different temperature, and they used all of it at once. Directly over the firebox was the hottest zone, where the skillet sat for frying. 6 inches to the right, the heat dropped enough for a steady simmer. The back corner barely held a warm-up temperature, perfect for keeping gravy from skinning over. Above it all, the warming shelf, a flat ledge near the stovepipe, held plates at serving temperature, kept bread dough rising and dried herbs without scorching them. A woman working one of these stoves in the 1930s was running 4 heat zones simultaneously without a single dial. She adjusted by sliding pots across the surface, opening or closing the damper, and adding a split of hickory when the fire dropped too low. You knew the stove was right when you could hold your hand 6 inches above the surface and count to 3 before pulling away. Fatback had no glamour. It was the part of the hog nobody else wanted. Pure white fat, salted and stored in a crock. But in Appalachian kitchens from the 1930s through the 1960s, it was the engine of every meal. You sliced it thin, laid it in a cold skillet, and let it render slow. By the time the slices went brown and rigid at the edges, the pan was full of clear golden fat worth more than the meat itself. The crackling slices got eaten, salty, crunchy, intensely porky, but the drippings went into a jar by the stove that was never empty if the family was doing all right. A half-pound of fatback cost a few cents at the company store in coal towns across West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, and it seasoned every pot of beans, every skillet of greens, every pan of cornbread for a month. You didn't measure. You poured until the color looked right, and if you had to ask what that meant, you hadn't spent enough time watching. The jar by the stove was the first thing to disappear when the next generation moved to town.
Stewed tomatoes over rice appeared whenever canned tomatoes needed using, or fresh ones threatened to go soft. Black housewives simmered tomatoes with onions, a little sugar to cut the acidity, and seasonings until they broke down into a thick, savory sauce. Poured over steaming white rice, the dish became a complete meal that cost almost nothing. Some cooks added bacon or salt pork for richness, while others kept it simple with butter stirred in at the end. The tomatoes soaked into the rice, turning each forkful tangy and satisfying. Children who complained about vegetables ate this without protest because the sweetness balanced the acidity. Housewives made it when money was tight or when gardens produced more than could be eaten fresh. Stewed tomatoes over rice proved canned goods could become something worth craving.
Before white sugar reached the mountain stores at a price anyone could pay, sorghum was the sweetener that held Appalachian kitchens together. And making it was an event that shut down the whole hollow for a day. The cane grew tall as corn along creek beds, planted from seeds saved the year before. Come October, families stripped the leaves, cut the stalks, and fed them through a wooden roller press hitched to a mule walking in circles. The green juice ran into a copper evaporator pan over a wood fire, and from there it was stirring, hours of it, skimming the green foam, watching the color darken, waiting for the moment the syrup sheeted off the paddle instead of dripping. The tradition carried African roots brought through enslaved people into Appalachia, and by the 1940s, Kentucky led the nation in sorghum production. A single fall batch filled enough jars to sweeten biscuits, cakes, and coffee all winter. The stir-offs are mostly gone now. The taste they left behind is not. Squirrel was free, and in the hills of eastern Kentucky and western North Carolina, free meat meant everything when the alternative was money the family didn't have. A single gray squirrel filled a skillet. 2 or 3 made a proper supper. Brown the pieces in hot lard until the outside crisped. Pull them out. Add flour and water. Stir until the gravy thickened and turned a deep brown. And what you had was something wild and slightly nutty that no store-bought package ever matched. The squirrel hunting season in Appalachian communities was a social institution. Men and boys went out together in the early morning the way their fathers had, and what came back fed everyone for days. Mark Sohn, the food historian and author of Appalachian Home Cooking, documented squirrel gravy as one of the defining dishes of mountain Kentucky food culture, a dish that required no recipe because the women who made it had been making it their whole lives, as had the women who taught them. The knowledge lived in the hands, not in any written-down place, and when the hands stopped, so did the gravy.
Tomato sandwiches appeared when gardens produced more ripe tomatoes than families could eat before they spoiled. Black housewives sliced thick rounds of red tomatoes, still warm from the sun, and layered them between soft white bread spread with mayonnaise. Salt and pepper was sprinkled on top, and the sandwich was pressed so the juices soaked into the bread. It was simple enough for children to make, yet satisfying enough that adults craved it after long days. The tomatoes had to be perfectly ripe, bursting with sweetness and acidity. Store-bought tomatoes could never replicate what came fresh from backyard plots. Families ate them for lunch, dinner, and late-night snacks during the hottest months. The dish required no cooking, no recipe, and no skill beyond knowing when a tomato reached perfection.
Hog killing day in the mountains was not a chore. It was an event, and every family within walking distance came to help because the work was enormous and the rules were absolute. Nothing was wasted. The hams and shoulders went to the smokehouse for months of curing over hickory. The leaf lard, fat from around the kidneys, prized above all other fat, was rendered slowly for baking. Intestines were cleaned, scraped, turned inside out, and stuffed with seasoned sausage. The head simmered for hours until the meat was picked from the skull and pressed into head cheese with vinegar and spices. Feet became souse, skin became cracklings, rendered crisp and crumbled into cornbread. The blood in some Scots-Irish mountain families was caught in a pan and cooked into pudding. Bones went into the soup pot and simmered until they gave up everything. One animal, slaughtered in November, fed a family through March. Red-eye gravy required exactly two things: country ham and black coffee, the stronger the better. You fried the ham, pulled it out, poured a cup of dark coffee over the hot drippings, and scraped the browned bits loose as it hissed. 3 minutes. Done. Some people in Appalachia called it red sop, and the name came from the reddish ring the coffee and fat left at the skillet's edge, darker on the outside, lighter in the center, like an eye. Country ham had been a staple in Virginia and the Mountain South since colonial times, and the tradition of deglazing ham drippings with coffee likely came from Scots-Irish settlers who wasted nothing and never saw a reason to change. You poured it over grits or biscuits, and the bitterness of the coffee cut the salt and fat in a way that shouldn't have worked, but absolutely did. But the quick suppers didn't end with ham. Beneath all that smoky pork lay a whole world of mountain resourcefulness, where garden scraps and foraged food and vegetables nobody else wanted carried as much weight as any cut of meat.
Butter beans and ham hocks simmered all day on the back of the stove, filling the house with an aroma that promised comfort. Black housewives soaked dry butter beans overnight, then cooked them slowly with smoked ham hocks that released their salty, smoky essence into the broth. Onions, garlic, bay leaves, and black pepper created a rich liquid that the beans absorbed as they softened. The ham hocks provided enough meat to flavor the entire pot and gave children something to pick at once served. The beans turned creamy and tender, bursting with flavor when bitten. Served with cornbread for soaking up the broth, this meal fed large families for little money. Housewives made it without recipes because they watched their mothers make it the same way. It was tradition, nutrition, and love in a single pot.
Every kitchen in the mountains kept a jar of bacon grease next to the stove, and if you grew up in one of those houses, you already know the rules. You never poured it out. You never let it burn. You strained it through cheesecloth or an old piece of flour sack into a tin can or a crockery jar, and it sat there, warm, golden, ready, beside the salt and the cast iron. That jar was the starting point for nearly everything: cornbread, fried potatoes, wilted greens, gravy, even popcorn on a Saturday night. Store-bought oil cost money nobody had, but the grease came free with breakfast every single morning. One strip of bacon produced enough fat to fry an egg and season a skillet. A month's worth could carry a household through the lean stretches between hog-killing seasons. Your grandmother never called it recycling. She called it common sense. The jar is gone from most kitchens now, and she would not understand why. Nobody called them hoecakes because they were fashionable. They got the name because early Appalachian settlers sometimes cooked them on the flat of a hoe blade held over an open fire when no skillet was available, a technique documented in the Foxfire series of oral histories from the 1970s. By the time these kitchens were at their peak, hoecakes were made in cast iron with no ceremony. Cornmeal, a pinch of salt, enough water for a pourable batter, dropped onto a hot greased skillet in silver dollar rounds and cooked until the edges went lacy. They were done in under 10 minutes. No oven, no yeast, no waiting. You could make them while the beans simmered and have bread on the table before the pot was ready. Some cooks added an egg. Most didn't. They used what they had, which was cornmeal and bacon grease in a hot pan. Younger generations grew up thinking cornbread always came from a box and always baked in the oven. So the knowledge of making bread on a stovetop with nothing but cornmeal and heat slipped away quietly, without anyone choosing to let it go.
Salmon croquettes were a Friday night tradition made from canned salmon mixed with eggs, onions, and cracker crumbs to hold everything together. Housewives shaped the mixture into patties by hand, never measuring, relying on feel to know when it was ready. Fried until golden and crispy on the outside, the croquettes had a tender, flaky interior that tasted better than the humble origins suggested. Served alongside rice or grits with hot sauce, they turned a simple can of fish into a feast. Canned salmon was affordable and shelf-stable, perfect for families watching every penny. Children loved the crispy edges, often fighting over the last patty. Salmon croquettes represented thrift and ingenuity, turning pantry staples into something that felt special.
Nobody in those kitchens ever seasoned a skillet on purpose. They just cooked in it, morning, noon, and night, and the iron did the rest. Every pour of grease, every batch of cornbread, every round of fried okra laid down another thin layer of polymerized fat that turned raw metal into something slicker than any factory coating. The old women knew which skillet was ready for eggs and which one still needed more time. They knew never to use soap, never to let it soak, and never to put it away wet. A good cast iron pan passed from mother to daughter like jewelry, heavier than it looked, black as night, and worth more than anything in the cupboard. Wagner and Griswold foundries produced the best ones through the 1950s, and those old pans are still the ones people fight over at estate sales. The new ones come pre-seasoned from a factory. The old ones came seasoned by a lifetime of somebody's hands. Kushaw was a hillbilly squash that most of the country never heard of. A large, crook-necked, cream and green-striped gourd that grew heavy on the vine in Appalachian gardens from Virginia down through Georgia, one of the few crops robust enough to thrive in Rocky Mountain soil. Its roots went deeper than European settlement. The Cherokee had been cultivating Kushaw for centuries before Scots-Irish settlers arrived, and those settlers learned to grow it from the people who already knew, the same way they learned corn and beans. Sliced thin and laid into a hot skillet with butter and a sprinkle of brown sugar, it cooked fast, the sugar caramelizing at the edges, the flesh going soft and sweet and slightly stringy in a way that butternut or acorn squash never managed. Appalachian food writer Ronnie Lundy, in her James Beard award-winning cookbook Victuals, described Kushaw as tied to mountain memory in a way that nutritional language alone cannot hold. The Foxfire Fund in Mountain City, Georgia, still works to preserve heirloom crops like Kushaw, but the women who knew the exact moment to pull it from the pan are mostly gone.
Smothered cabbage turned a humble head into something savory and satisfying. Black housewives sliced cabbage into thick ribbons, then cooked it slowly in a covered skillet with bacon grease, onions, and seasonings. The cabbage softened gradually, absorbing smoky richness while developing a sweet, caramelized flavor. Some cooks added vinegar for brightness or sugar to balance bitterness. The dish cooked until tender but not mushy, requiring attention and occasional stirring. Served alongside cornbread and beans, smothered cabbage stretched a single vegetable into enough food for the family. It was economical, nutritious, and tied to the rhythm of stretching resources. Housewives made it from memory, adjusting seasonings by taste rather than measurement. Smothered cabbage proved vegetables could star at the table when treated with care.
In late summer, when the apple trees bent heavy with fruit, the real work started. Not the picking, but the preserving. She peeled them in one long spiral with a paring knife worn thin from years of use, and the peels went straight into a pot for apple butter. The slices she threaded onto lengths of cotton twine with a darning needle and hung from the ceiling beams or the porch rafters. They dried in the warm air over days, shrinking into leathery rings that lasted through winter. Come January, those dried apples rehydrated with sugar and spices for fried pies, or slow-cooked into filling for a stack cake, or simmered into what mountain families called cooked fruit, their word for applesauce. No dehydrator, no canning equipment, no electricity required, just twine, a knife, and a warm room. The women who did this every fall did it the same way their mothers had, and the ones who remember can close their eyes and be back in that kitchen the moment the smell returns. Wood cost labor and labor cost time, so every fire had to justify itself. Bulldog gravy was what you made when there was no meat at all, also called white gravy or milk gravy or just gravy with no qualifier. It started with whatever fat you had, a heaping spoon of flour stirred in until the roux thickened, and then milk or water poured in slow. In Appalachia, the version made with water instead of milk was sometimes called poor gravy, even by the people who ate it, because they knew the difference and they felt it. You poured it over day-old cornbread that had gone dry, and the gravy brought it back to something that could fill a stomach. In Kentucky and West Virginia, mining communities during the Depression, and again during the coal slowdowns of the 1950s and 60s, this was what supper looked like on the worst weeks of the month. Not a figure of speech, just the actual food on the actual table. The children who ate it grew up and moved to cities and never made it again, and some never told their own kids it had existed.
Hot water cornbread was made with nothing more than cornmeal, boiling water, and salt, yet it became a beloved staple in Black households. Housewives poured scalding water over cornmeal and stirred until a thick paste formed, then shaped it by hand into small oval patties. Dropped into hot oil, the patties fried until golden and crispy outside while staying dense and chewy inside. The texture was different from baked cornbread, more substantial and satisfying. Served alongside beans, greens, or fried fish, hot water cornbread soaked up pot liquor and stretched meals further. Children loved the crispy edges and would eat them plain when nothing else was available. The recipe required no eggs, milk, or leavening, making it possible even when the pantry was bare. Hot water cornbread was survival food that tasted like home.
When the lettuce went limp or the carrots turned soft, nobody in a mountain kitchen threw them out. They filled a bowl with cold water, stirred in a teaspoon of salt, and let those tired vegetables sit for about an hour. The cells in the leaves and roots absorbed the water, the walls stiffened back up, and what looked ready for the compost pile came back crisp enough to serve. Household guides in the 1950s documented the trick, and decades later, food scientists confirmed that cold water increases pressure inside plant cell walls, while the salt bolsters the pectin that holds them rigid. The mountain women who used it every week did not need a laboratory. They had watched their own mothers do it. Overnight, soaking could bloat vegetables too far, so the 1-hour window was the sweet spot. Long enough to revive, short enough to keep the texture honest. Nothing left the kitchen until it had given everything it could. The first frost came fast in the mountains and killed whatever was still green overnight. Fried green tomatoes were what you made the week before. Every tomato that hadn't ripened, sliced thick, dredged through cornmeal with salt and pepper, and laid into a skillet of hot bacon grease until the outside went golden and crackled and the inside softened just enough to give. They weren't the romanticized version that arrived in restaurants decades later. They were a practical harvest, a way of eating what would otherwise rot on the vine. The cornmeal crust transformed the chalky bitterness of an unripe tomato into something with texture and heat, and enough fat to feel like a meal. Mountain families in North Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee had done this since the 19th century, using cornmeal ground at the nearest mill. You never added anything fancy to the dredge. The grease had to be hot enough that the slice sizzled the second it touched the pan. If it didn't, you'd waited too long. If you had to ask how hot the grease was, you weren't ready to cook them.
Flour gravy over rice stretched almost nothing into something warm and filling. Black housewives heated bacon drippings in a cast iron skillet, sprinkled in flour, and stirred constantly until it turned golden brown. Water or milk was added slowly to prevent lumps, creating a thick gravy seasoned with salt and pepper. Poured over white rice, it became dinner for an entire family. The gravy carried the essence of whatever meat had been cooked before, absorbing flavors from pork chops or fried chicken. Children asked for seconds because it tasted rich, despite costing almost nothing. Mothers made it when the pantry was bare, but mouths still needed feeding. It was survival food that felt like comfort, proof that skill could transform simple ingredients into something memorable.
Long before any of those vegetables hit the table, the most radical trick in these kitchens started not at the stove, but in the front yard, with a hollow log, a bucket, and a pile of fireplace ash. Water poured slowly over the ashes and caught in a wooden bucket below produced lye, And that lye transformed dried corn kernels into hominy through a process called nixtamalization, a technique with Cherokee and indigenous roots going back thousands of years. The kernels soaked until their skins slipped off, swelling into something white, tender, and entirely different from the hard yellow corn that went in. What the old cooks could not have known was that this process unlocked niacin trapped inside the corn, a vitamin the body cannot absorb from untreated kernels, and it was the reason mountain families who ate hominy avoided the pellagra that devastated communities further south. The same ash that heated the house also made the soap and freed the nutrition in the grain. Tomato gravy started in the bacon grease left from breakfast. A spoon of flour stirred in until the roux turned pale gold, then a quart of home-canned tomatoes dumped in and mashed down with a fork. The whole thing thickened in the time it took to split the biscuits. It wasn't a sauce. It was a gravy. And there's a difference any mountain cook would insist on, because a sauce is something fancy, and a gravy is what you make when supper has to come from the shelf. Families across Kentucky and West Virginia kept canned tomatoes year-round for this dish, putting up 40 or 50 quarts each August so that winter suppers had something red and hot to pour over bread. The trick was the roux. You couldn't rush it, and the women who made this knew the exact moment the flour changed from raw to ready just by the way the skillet smelled. You poured it over biscuits that were already cold, and the gravy brought them back to life. The last jar of tomatoes in February had a different weight to it, and she always said so.
Fried okra appeared when gardens overflowed with green pods that grew faster than families could pick them. Black housewives sliced okra into rounds, dredged them in seasoned cornmeal, and fried them in hot oil until crispy and golden. The coating turned crunchy while the okra inside stayed tender, creating an irresistible texture contrast. Served hot from the skillet, fried okra was eaten by hand like popcorn or piled onto plates alongside other vegetables. The cornmeal absorbed the okra's natural moisture, preventing the sliminess that put some people off. Children who claimed to hate okra would devour it fried, asking for more before the batch finished. Housewives made it quickly during busy summer days, knowing it would disappear fast. Fried okra connected families to their gardens and the simple pleasure of eating what they grew.
White half-runner beans were not the beans you bought at a grocery store. They were a specific Appalachian heirloom variety, a pole bean with a creamy white hull and a green runner, developed over generations by mountain gardeners in the region, stretching from southwestern Virginia through eastern Tennessee and into western North Carolina. They grew on poles. They had to be strung and broken by hand, and the children old enough to sit still were expected to help. They cooked faster than dried pintos and tasted different, earthier, starchier, with a flavor that people from outside the region found hard to describe and people from inside recognized instantly as home. You put them in a pot with fatback and water, brought them to a boil, and let them go until they were soft enough to mash with your tongue. You didn't time it. You tasted. The seeds were passed between families the way recipes should be. No paperwork, just a jar over the fence in the fall. When families stopped growing gardens, the half-runner slipped away with them. Those kitchens are quiet now. Leave a name in the comments if these habits belong to someone you loved.